A big thanks to George and Carol for inviting me. You know, I've gotten the information on the Marion Symposium every year since they've had it, and I've never had the opportunity to come up. And just every year I see they really have some great speakers, and big thanks to them for organizing this every year. I think it's just a super event. They did ask me to come up some time ago to discuss prisoners of war, but it was with the caveat. They said there must be some way you can work Francis Marion in on that, and I will do my best to do that, because actually I've got quite a bit to say about that. Prisoners of war, for those, you know, almost everybody here is a military historian, and this is probably preaching to the choir, but they pretty much had a bad rap throughout history. I mean, if you go back to ancient times, the Romans killed or sold into slavery the combatants they captured. Up into the Civil War, you know, we know the horrors of Andersonville, but, you know, there just almost as many Confederates died in camps such as Fort Delaware and Camp Douglas in Chicago as did at Andersonville. You get into the 20th century, probably no worse situation than American, or really all Allied prisoners that were in Japanese hands during World War II, and, you know, on into Korea and Vietnam. So shouldn't be a surprise that prisoners of war during the Revolution are going to equally be in pretty dire straits. As far as prisoners of war for the British, it's a very sticky issue for them, because when the war breaks out in 1775, their inclination is going to be, well, these people are traitors. You know, we should anyone that falls into our hands that's been opposing the crown should be put to death. And the problem with that, however, as happens quickly into the Revolution, is British soldiers are going to fall into American hands. So it's very difficult to simply hang or torture, execute American soldiers who are in British hands, because the colonists could do the very same thing to the British soldiers. So we find that doesn't happen. The other problem the British have is that only sovereign nations in British eyes had the luxury of having their captured men treated as POWs. As we know, the very unclear situation when the war breaks out, because Americans have not declared independence. This is not an independent nation that we're talking about. So British did have some issues as far as how they were to treat these men. Now, early on, I mentioned that the British are going to capture significant numbers of men, and the first time they capture large numbers is during the Canadian campaign in 1775 and 1776. Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold make an attack on Quebec on the night of December 31st of 1775. The attack turns out to be a disaster. Montgomery is killed, Arnold is badly wounded, and it pretty much falls apart. Daniel Morgan, who will, as we all know, will become very famous in South Carolina a few years later, is one of the men captured by the British. And Guy Carleton is the commander in Canada at that time. And he actually tries a unique approach. The captured men from the American force are put in comfortable housing for the winter up in Quebec. They're fed very, very nicely. And then in the spring, Carleton lets them go, lets them return to their respective colonies. And his hope was that if he treated these folks with this kind of kindness, that they'd go back and tell the other Americans that, hey, the British in America aren't so bad. Well, we know that strategy backfires, because it's in the summer of 1776, obviously, when independence is declared. And operations around New York in the summer and fall of 1776 are going to put large numbers of prisoners into British hands, particularly the Battle of Long Island in late August, and then at Fort Washington in early November of 1776. And in fact, more Continental troops are captured at the Battle of Fort Washington than are captured in any other battle of the war, including in Charleston in 1780. Now, the British are not prepared to bring or to hold on to all these prisoners, but they've got to make some accommodation. A large number at the outset are going to be packed into the Sugar House, which is a large storehouse for sugar in Manhattan, and pretty much shoulder to shoulder in this place. They're fed very poorly. Smallpox breaks out among them, a lot of sickness among them, very high mortality rate. The British then also make use of prison ships in New York Harbor, principally in Wallabout Bay, and the prison ship had been used quite a bit actually earlier in the early parts of the 18th century. A very convenient way to put prisoners, to confine prisoners and prevent escape because they were all, they had a natural moat around them by being on these boats. Usually they would take ships that were out of commission, that were pretty much at the end of their useful lives. They'd strip them of their masts, their rigging, they'd close up the portholes, and store the men below decks. Now, with these ships, it was have very high mortality rates among these prisoners on prison ships. And a couple of reasons for that. Number one is because you have these men confined in these tight spaces, like they were at the sugar house, but also in the holds of these prison ships. And so if you have diseases like smallpox that are very contagious, the contagion is going to spread very quickly. And so smallpox, particularly early in the war, when the Continental Army had not really engaged in widespread smallpox inoculation, you do have that disease spreading very quickly at very, very high mortality rates. The other problem you have on the prison ships is going to be dysentery. And one of the reasons for that is on many of these ships, they would use large tubs or buckets as latrines. And if you can believe this, they would use those same buckets and tubs to bring fresh water onto the ship. So you can imagine that dysentery would be very, very difficult to contain, principally because they would have had no way to disinfect those things when they brought them off the ship other than to rinse them out. So you do have a great amount of mortality among the prisoners that were held in New York. One historian has estimated that as many as 17,000 men perished on prison ships in New York or in the sugar house in New York, and at least as many as 11,000. So again, quite a bit of mortality among these men. Now, how could a prisoner get relief from these horrid conditions? Well, one way was escape. If for a prison ship, for instance, if a man could swim and he could get overboard, he could potentially swim to shore. Now, the problem with that would be, particularly in New York, if the weather was bad, if it was the middle of the winter, it would be a very difficult thing to do without dying from exposure. The other problem was, because the men had poor diet principally and were very poorly clad, they'd be very weak from disease, so you couldn't necessarily swim to shore even if you wanted to. Another way of getting out of these conditions would have been enlistment with the British. And as bad an option as this sounds to us today, it was actually pretty common practice in European wars leading up to the Revolution, where enemies or armies that had captured large numbers of enemy troops would try to enlist them into their own forces. Now, British officers were not crazy about this option. In fact, if you read some of Cornwallis's papers from 1780, 1781, he discourages it, at least for a while, discourages his men or his recruiting officers from enlisting prisoners, because he feels that, and this turned out to be true with men from Savannah, that they're going to desert very quickly and return home or return to the American forces. It was a very popular option among provincial units, among the Loyalist units. In fact, the British Legion recruited large numbers of men from the prison ships around New York. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about South Carolina. The other way that you could be relieved of the burden of being in captivity would be exchange. Exchange simply meant that one army held a certain number of prisoners, the enemy held a certain number of prisoners, and they would exchange equal amounts of men. Now, there were a lot of difficulties with this in America. Number one, the sides often held unequal numbers of prisoners. For instance, right after the battle of, or after the fall of Charleston, the British had significantly more prisoners than did the Americans. Same thing with after the Battle of Saratoga, when the Americans captured more than the British had in their possession. One of the other problems was unequal ranks. The British, as we know, have a lieutenant general fighting in America. That would be Lord Cornwallis. Americans only had major generals, and then there was General Washington as commander-in-chief. So there was sometimes no one to exchange for other officers. The other problem was British regiments that fought in America typically did not have a colonel. The colonel was the owner of the regiment, and usually he didn't fight with the unit in America. So a lot of times you would have a lot of lieutenant colonels and no colonels to exchange for. So, and then one other issue was regulars versus militia. Did British soldiers count the same as American militia? So there were some difficulties surrounding it. But probably the biggest difficulty was the political aspect of it. The British did not want to enter into negotiations with the Continental Congress for the exchange of prisoners, because if they did so, they would be recognizing the Continental Congress as a legitimate political body, and they were not prepared to do that. The Continental Congress, on the other hand, when they wanted to enter into exchange negotiations with the British, were insistent that the Americans, or that the British recognize American independence. And as we know, up until 1782 or 1783, the British were not prepared to do that. So there was never any large-scale exchange of all prisoners by both sides. What the Continental Congress ultimately did was they gave Washington and ultimately Nathaniel Greene here in the Southern Department authorization to make partial exchanges, so to exchange soldiers in the department. So they handed that authority over to the departmental commander or over to General Washington, and that's how the prisoner of war exchanges actually got done during the Revolutionary War. Now, as far as prisoners in the South, the British, as we know, are going to take Savannah in December 1778. They capture a good number of men there. They do make use of prison ships again in the Savannah River, off of Savannah. And conditions there are going to be just as bad as in New York. We have a large amount of mortality among these men. And we do have a number of cases of the British going on board the ships to recruit American soldiers. But really the biggest bag of prisoners in the Southern campaigns, as we know, is going to be at Charleston at the siege, or the conclusion of the siege in May of 1780. This would be the largest loss of American prisoners in the war. Lincoln surrenders approximately 6,000 men to Sir Henry Clinton and Admiral Merritt Arbuthnot, and it's actually the largest loss to a foreign power of prisoners up until the fall of Bataan in 1942. Brief overview of the siege. As we know, Clinton and Arbuthnot are going to land on Seabrook Island in February of 1780. They're going to march across the Sea Islands and ultimately besiege the city. Arbuthnot in early April gets his ships into Charleston Harbor, cuts off Charleston by sea. Clinton is going to come down the peninsula, dig a siege parallels across the Charleston Peninsula, and hem in Charleston by land. Once the British cavalry under Tarleton defeats the American cavalry at Monk's Corner and then later at Lanús Ferry, they pretty much cut off any escape for the Americans. And so late in the siege, around the early part of May, they begin to enter into negotiations for the surrender of the town. Let me back up briefly, though, because right at the outset of the siege, in early April, Lincoln and his officers begin to talk about the prospect of evacuating the city. And one of the Continental officers, actually Moultrie and General Lackland McIntosh of Georgia, had insisted that they at least try to get the Continental soldiers out of Charleston. And this eventually falls through because of some pressure from the civilian authorities. But they do make an offer to the British to give up the city in exchange for letting the Continental Army basically escape into the backcountry of South Carolina and letting the militia go home. Well, the British had their ships in the harbor, and Clinton was, entrenched across Charleston Neck. There was no way that they were going to let the Americans enter into this kind of a deal. So then the negotiations do fall through. Then we get to May 8th. British are just about 100 yards from the American defenses. They've hemmed in the city, as I pointed out, and they again enter into negotiations for the surrender of Charleston. This time, Lincoln realizes he's up against the wall, and he offers outright to have his Continental soldiers become prisoners of war with the British. And of course, Clinton is ready to accept that. But he's not ready to accept Lincoln's second stipulation. And what Lincoln wanted to do was allow his militia to just go home, to return to their homes throughout South Carolina and also back to North Carolina. Well, again, Clinton has Lincoln on the ropes. He's not about to accept this and allow these men to go home and simply face him again in the backcountry. And so he insists that they be prisoners of war on parole. So they're allowed to go home, but they'll be on parole. I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. Lincoln says, no, they've got to go home. They've got to be allowed to just go home and be free. And so negotiations break down. The British and Americans begin to fire one another once again. May 8th, May 9th is the largest bombardment that Charleston would see up until the Civil War. And interesting thing is, the next day, Lincoln receives a number of petitions from the militia in the garrison. And they say in these petitions, General Lincoln, we hear that the Negotiations for the surrender of Charleston broke down over our status as prisoners of war on parole, and we're perfectly happy being prisoners of war on parole. I guess they pretty much had enough at that point. A little bit of a slap in the face to Lincoln, but because he was trying to get the best terms for them. So sheepishly, Lincoln now has to go out to Henry Clinton and say, yeah, I will accept those terms. And Clinton browbeats him a little bit, but he does allow him to have the terms that were offered just a few days earlier. What they're going to do is sign what were known as the Articles of Capitulation. Articles of Capitulation were essentially the surrender agreement for turning over the city and the prisoners to Charleston, and these are going to be signed on May 12th. What happens to the 6,000 men in the garrison? Well, we know the Continental troops are going to be British prisoners of war, and they're going to be housed at first in the barracks in Charleston, which is approximately where George and St. Philip Street is in downtown Charleston, right kind of in the center of the College of Charleston. In fact, if any of you had ever been by the old College of Charleston Library, there used to be a monument there to Andrew Jackson's mother, and she had actually come into Charleston after the fall of the city to nurse Patriot prisoners, and they then contracted smallpox while she was there and died in the city of Charleston. That's approximately where the barracks would have been, where that monument is. So the Continental enlisted are going to go into captivity. The Continental officers, technically they are paroled also, but they're required to be housed at Hadrill's Point over in Mount Pleasant. So the British make efforts to separate their Continental officers from the Continental soldiers. And Governor Rutledge thought this was to make it easier for the British to recruit the enlisted men. So they're going to be loosely held in Charleston for a few months in the barracks, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But the Continental officers, again, they're sent to Hadrill's Point. Well, who is in the garrison at the outset of the siege of Charleston? But Francis Marion. And I told you I would get to him today. Why was Marion not taken? Well, legend has it that prior to the siege breaking out, one of the local Charleston dandies had a party at his house at the corner of Orange and Trad Street, and Marion attended this party. And I don't know if this comes from Parson Weems or one of the other Marion biographers, but there's the idea that Marion was a teetotaler, and he apparently, again according to the legend, was taken back by the number of toasts that were having to be drunk at this party, and lets himself out a first-floor window where he either breaks or badly sprains his ankle. Well, we don't know if this is true or not, and clearly it very much sounds like one of these traditional Marion legends. The fact of the matter is, Marion at some point early in the siege suffered a very severe injury. That we do know. Because on April 13th, General Lincoln evacuates all his wounded officers and the important civilian officials from the town. So Governor Rutledge leaves at that time, and Francis Marion is evacuated with these other soldiers. And whether he jumped out the window or not, had he not had that injury at the outset of the siege, none of us would probably even be here today, because he would have been in captivity till at least the middle of 1781, and probably would not have been able to do the wonderful things he did to the British in the backcountry. Now, as far as the militia are concerned, they are going to be sent home, but as prisoners of war on parole. What does that mean? Well, when you were a prisoner on parole, you were to basically avoid any action whatsoever, avoid any assistance to the Patriot forces. As their document that they signed when they were leaving the city said, they were not to do or cause anything to be done prejudicial to the success of His Majesty's arms, or hold any criminal intercourse or correspondence with his enemy. So again, they are pretty much to stay out of the action altogether. And as long as they did this, Article 4 of the Articles of Capitulation said that the militia of the garrison shall be permitted to return to their respective homes as prisoners of war on parole, which parole, as long as they observe, shall secure them from being molested in their property by the British troops. And this is going to become important in just a minute when we talk about some of these men who broke those paroles. So the militia, the Continentals go into captivity. The militia, in the weeks after the siege, are going to march to their homes in the backcountry of South Carolina. Some are going to return to North Carolina. And the British, as we know, move out into South Carolina after that point. The next large bag of prisoners is going to be at Camden and also at Fishing Creek. In those two actions, Cornwallis and Tarleton capture an additional 1,000 men between those two actions. As we know, at Camden, the bulk of those men were Maryland and Delaware Continentals, although there were some North Carolina militia who had fought with Dixon who were also taken there. Cornwallis does not want to use Camden as a prisoner of war depot. He feels that the climate there is too unhealthy for it, and he wants to march all these men down into Charleston. And so in the weeks after the Battle of Camden, he begins to do so. And this is where we draw in Francis Marion again, who's now in August of 1780 active and in the field, and operating in the area of Nelson's Ferry on the Santee River. The British send the Continental troops in detachments of 150 to 200 men with an escort down towards Charleston. Marion gets word of this, and on August 25th, he is going to ambush one of these detachments at Great Savannah near Nelson's Ferry. The British have about 40 men guarding these men. Marion has about 70. He attacks the British column, kills and wounds a number of these men, and takes about 20 British and Loyalist soldiers. He's going to free the 150 Americans that were being taken down from Camden to Charleston. Among them were Private Michael Ellis of the 2nd Maryland, who later noted in his pension application that it was captured at Camden and retaken by Marion near Santee Ferry, and then rejoined his company at Hillsborough. And we know Hillsborough is where the American Army refitted after the Battle of Camden. Thomas Mason, a private in the Delaware Regiment, was also captured at Camden, as he said, retaken by Marion, marched to North Carolina and then on to Hillsborough. And also Isaac Lansdale, who, as he said, was retaken on the road to Charleston by Colonel F. Marion, then went on to Hillsborough. Well, all three of these men go to Hillsborough. Why is that? Marion had even said in his report to Gates a few days after this action that a number of his men had left his command because they had heard about what had happened at Camden and heard about what had happened at Fishing Creek and had abandoned Marion. And so Marion is very short on men. So here he's got 150 Continentals, trained soldiers that could have joined his command, but he sends them on to Hillsborough. And this is really the genius of Marion. He's able to support his own interests to that of the overall war effort in South Carolina. So really impressive that instead of keeping these men with him, he's going to send them up to rejoin Gates in North Carolina. And I know it's kind of an accepted thing here at the Marion Symposium that you can take a dig at Sumter here and there. And that is in sharp contrast to Thomas Sumter, who didn't necessarily always put the larger war effort subordinate to his interests. So really impressive that Marion did that. Now, not all of the men that Marion was able to take back at Nelson's Ferry were so eager to return to the American cause. In fact, Marion reported to Gates that they are much dissatisfied with their officers. And approximately 75 of them refused to go with Marion. They refused to be sent back up to Hillsborough. In fact, they insisted that they go on to Charlestown and be held there as British prisoners. Now, in a way, you can't blame them. Again, these were the Maryland and Delaware Continentals. They had endured the worst winter of the 18th century at Morristown, New Jersey. There were a couple occasions during that winter where the Army went without food for 2 or 3 days. They had marched, 600-700 miles through North Carolina and South Carolina summer to get to the Battle of Camden, where their officers, principally their commanding officer, terribly mismanaged them and had ended up as British prisoners. So, in a sense, you can't blame a lot of these men for having had it with the Patriot cause. So these men do go on to Charleston, and now the British have a problem because you have this. In addition to the about 2,400 Continental enlisted men who were captured at the siege, you now have another 1,000 men being brought into Charleston from the backcountry. And one of the problems the British were having immediately after the fall of Charleston is, again, these men were put in the barracks. And I didn't bring any slides today. I wish I brought the one slide that shows the proximity of the American barracks, which was probably only about 100 yards from the defense lines in Charleston. So the Americans are being held very close to essentially the outskirts of Charleston. And what happens during those next couple of months after the fall of the city is you have large numbers. It's estimated that about 1,000 men during the course of the captivity in Charleston, escaped from the city and were able to get into the backcountry. And because of the proximity of the barracks to the lines, it made it much easier for men to get out of Charleston. So the British are unable to control these men. And so Nisbet Balfour, who's the commandant of Charleston, is going to make a fatal decision for some of these prisoners. And that is he's going to transfer a large number of them to prison ships in Charleston Harbor. And he's got to do this because of the large number that are coming in from Camden. And as you can imagine, as at Savannah, as in New York, very unhealthy conditions on the prison ships in Charleston. The large numbers of men have a serious deficiency in clothing, substandard rations. They haven't been paid in months. They have no funds to purchase any necessaries for themselves. And of course, they're racked by disease. You have smallpox is going to be a problem, principally among the militiamen. Not so much the Continental troops this late in the war, again, because of the inoculation. Dysentery, again, the same problem as in New York. But probably even worse is that they were dealing with mosquito-borne malaria in Charleston as well. So large numbers are dying off. In fact, by the end of October, the men go on board these prison ships at the beginning of September. Balfour reports that men are dying at a greater rate than that they had been escaping from the city earlier than that. So very bad conditions on the ships. But still, as with New York, if a man could swim and he could get off the ship, he could get to shore. And so you do have large numbers of escapes going on. Probably the bulk of the escapes that occurred in Charleston, again, that approximately 1,000, that's a loyalist estimate of the numbers who escaped from May of 1780 up until June of 1781, probably took place in those months before they went on the prison ships, when the barracks were so close to the lines. But also there were men who did get off the ships. In fact, William Cannon was one of these gentlemen. He and his comrades waited one night until the British guards came out in their boat. The guard went down below decks briefly, and Cannon and his 4 comrades commandeered the boat, rowed it across Charleston Harbor, would have gotten off at either Mount Pleasant or on Sullivan's Island, and made their way up to Georgetown. And they're going to there join Francis Marion. So they were among the many prisoners who would go on to fight with Marion. Cannon went on to serve 2 more years throughout the rest of the war with Francis Marion. Another one was Dixie Ward. He was a Continental soldier. He joined Marion at Fort Watson shortly after he escaped from Charleston. James DeMasters was a member of the 3rd Virginia Continentals who was captured at the siege and escapes in April of 1781, and on his way to the backcountry assists in the reduction of Fort Maude. There was actually an officer who escaped from Charleston who joins Marion. That was Lieutenant Joshua Rutledge of the 4th Maryland. He was wounded and captured at Camden, imprisoned first at Orangeburg, then at Edisto Island, and finally at Hadrill's Point. He escapes from Hadrill's Point and joins Marion, as he said, near Georgetown, and he assisted in besieging and taking that place. So a good number of men, not only are they escaping, but they're immediately making themselves available to American forces in the backcountry of South Carolina. Now, another group of prisoners who would have been available to join Marion are those who broke their paroles to do so. And there were numbers who did that after the fall of Charleston, much to the chagrin of the British. Now, this was a pretty major issue, this breaking of the parole, because by giving his parole, a man was saying, I vow not to serve against the British forces, or I vow not to do anything that's going to affect the British in the backcountry. But there were numbers of men who were going to do this. One of them was James Dixon. The night that he got home, he went in, he lived near Sumter. The night he gets home from the fall of Charleston, or from being released from Charleston, he burns the document, his parole, and the next day rides off to join Francis Marion. Another one was John Postel. Postel had fought in the siege of Charleston with the South Carolina militia, and he took his parole. And his plan was, as he said, to remain peaceably at my plantation until exchange. But shortly after he arrived home, 2 dragoons from the British Legion are going to arrive at his plantation, and they're going to demand one of his horses. As Postel said, he showed them his parole, and he offered to show them the Articles of Capitulation. the Legion Dragoons told them they had come for the horse, and have him they would. And so they did completely disregarded his complaints, and they take his horse. Sometime later, Postel is away from home briefly. More British Dragoons come to his plantation. They take additional horses. This time they ransack his house. They convince his slaves to run off. They harass his wife. They tell her that if it's a good thing he wasn't home because they would have killed him if he were. And they just generally give her the runaround. When Postel gets home and he finds out about this, he immediately goes off and joins Marion's brigade, as he said, and he would also serve with Marion throughout the rest of the war. Another gentleman was Joseph Baker. He was a member of the Charlestown Battalion of Artillery that had fought in the siege. He was on parole in Charleston, and the British were having a great deal of problems throughout their occupation with officers and other militiamen corresponding with people in the backcountry of South Carolina. In fact, there's one argument that one of the reasons that men were rounded up in Charleston and sent off to St. Augustine was because they had found papers from these gentlemen in the baggage that was captured at the Battle of Camden. And so the British are very unhappy with this, because by being on, as a prisoner of war on parole, you were not supposed to engage in this type of activity. And so when they find out more and more of this is taking place, they confine the militiamen in Charleston to their homes. And Joseph Baker is one of these men who's required to be on house arrest. And so he leaves the city, and he is going to make his way to Marion's camp and join up with the Swamp Fox. So many others broke paroles, joined Sumter and other partisan commanders. So this is a widespread problem for the British, because when they capture these men and they find out that they've broken their paroles, they're going to deal with them very harshly. In fact, after the Battle of Camden, General Smallwood wrote to Cornwallis concerning some American prisoners that had been taken in Camden that had been threatened to be hanged. Well, among these men were some British deserters who had joined the Americans, some men who had taken oaths of allegiance to the British who had joined the Americans, but also some men who had taken paroles. Cornwallis claims they only hung the deserters, but certainly the other men were confined. But you can understand why men who had been on parole would have rejoined the Americans based on the treatment they got. I mean, John Postel certainly had an argument, because if we go back to the Articles of Capitulation, they said that the militia would be protected in their persons and property as long as they observed their paroles, and Postel believed that he was doing that. The British, meanwhile, have a counter-argument, because they are capturing these men who had taken paroles at Charleston and are now fighting against them. So there were quite a few accusations and counter-accusations throughout the war in the backcountry that each side had violated the Articles of Capitulation from the fall of Charleston. Now there was another group of prisoners who fought with Marion who had a little bit of a different twist to them. These were men who had served with Marion in the 2nd South Carolina earlier in the war, who became prisoners at the Siege of Charleston, who had a very, very different fate for them. And that was, these were some of the men who actually did join the British forces. And this brings us to Lord Charles Montague, who had been the Royal Governor of South Carolina prior to Governor Campbell. And Montague was now serving as a provincial officer with the British. He was down in Jamaica with Governor John Dawling, and Dawling had been very active in taking expeditions to the Spanish Main, which is present-day Nicaragua, and attacking Spanish interests down there. The problem with that was a very brutal climate to be bringing large numbers of men in, and he would lose large numbers of soldiers in those endeavors to disease. And so he's looking for ways to expand these operations, and one way was to get more men. And what he does, under Montague's suggestion, is send Montague to South Carolina under the hopes of recruiting some of the prisoners that were captured in South Carolina and enlisting them in what was known as the Duke of Cumberland's regiment, which would serve with Dawling in the Spanish Main. So Montague comes to South Carolina, and as Royal Governor, he had pretty good relations with the people of South Carolina. He mentions William Moultrie, and he mentions Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, And he believed that he could convince these men to help him recruit among the soldiers in Charleston. But he, of course, from those officers receives a very poor response. They're completely uninterested in helping him. Nisbet Balfour, the commandant, is a little uneasy about this. As I mentioned, the regular officers were not crazy about this idea of recruiting enlisted men because, number one, I mentioned earlier the prospect that these men could simply desert and return to the American forces. But also, the Americans could do the very same thing. You know, they could go into the prison camp in Virginia where the Saratoga prisoners were being held and recruit among them. So British soldiers or British officers not crazy about this idea. So Balfour kind of puts Montague off. And he writes to Sir Henry Clinton in New York because Cornwallis at this point is off chasing Greene across North Carolina prior to the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, and he's not able to contact him. So he writes to Clinton and asks him about this. And Clinton writes him back, as British officers often were, very, very evasively, very vaguely, says, well, I think you ought to ask Cornwallis about that. You know, and so Balfour's kind of stuck. But he does make a decision, and he says, you know, I guess he figures he covers his bases by getting in touch with Clinton. And he gives Montague authorization to go onto the prison ships and into the barracks and try and recruit among the prisoners. And he meets with a lot of resistance, but also some willingness among these soldiers. When he goes on board, he's just appalled at the conditions, particularly the clothing. Some men, as he says, are almost naked. They're in terrible condition, and he does find men who are willing to join the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. He also finds men who, that's the last thing they want to do, is join the British forces. Now Montague is telling them, you know, we're going to give you fresh clothes, we're going to give you a bounty, you're only going to be fighting either in Jamaica or on the Spanish Main against Spanish or French forces, you won't fight against your own countrymen. So he's making a pretty good sales pitch, but still, many men are resistant. And so that's where Montague is actually going to use some strong-arm tactics. He sends a British sergeant aboard these ships, and his name was John Brown, and he is very brutal towards the prisoners. Beats them, kicks them, some are thrown overboard. They're told if they don't join the regiment that they're going to be sent up among the Royal Navy ships and transports. So he uses very strong-arm tactics. And through both of these efforts, through the men who joined willingly and those that were forced to, Montague ultimately races about 500 men for the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. And they are going to sail off for Jamaica in May of 1781. Now, we might not look too kindly on those who had volunteered to go with Montague. But keep in mind what they went through. And you know, we're talking about 1780 here, 1781. There really isn't a notion of the United States like we know it today. If men were going to be loyal at all, they were going to be loyal to their home state or their regiment. And you know, it's easy for us to judge them today. Geez, you know, if we were prisoners, we would never join enemy forces. But you know, it's a totally different situation in a nation that's 5 years old versus one that is as old as it is today. Many of them had lost hope that the Continental Congress was going to help them. As I said, a good number were almost without clothes. They were in rags. One soldier talks about lying down on the hard boards of the ship deck every night without a blanket. They'd seen their comrades die around them from various diseases, and they had served honorably. You know, some of them had served for the war, and they felt like their efforts had not been appreciated. And so that was a motivation, at least for some of those who had joined the British willingly. There were at least 13 men from the 2nd South Carolina who joined the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. And there's no way to tell because we have no written record. None of these men left pension records, whether they joined willingly or they submitted to the strong arm tactics. Of the 500 men who joined Montague, only about 6% of the enlistees were South Carolina Continentals. So that includes the 1st through the 6th regiments. The bulk came from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland. Primarily Virginia was the largest number of men recruited. After the war, these men are going to be, what happens is they're sent down to Jamaica. And the French have designs on Jamaica late in the war, but Admiral Rodney is going to defeat de Grasse at the Battle of the Saints and that prevents the French from ever threatening Jamaica. So these guys serve as garrison troops in Jamaica for the rest of the war. At the conclusion of the war, the British break up the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. It was a provincial regiment. The men are told they can either be let go on Jamaica and shift for themselves. They can go to England, or they can accept bounty land in Nova Scotia. And as we know, a lot of the loyalists after the war are going to go to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And actually a large number of them, about half the regiment, is going to accept bounty land up in Nova Scotia. At least two of the men from the 2nd South Carolina, so at least two of Marion's men, John Clemens and James Stanton, are going to be among those who accept bounty land in Nova Scotia and settle there. Interestingly, though, a number of the men who settle there realize, particularly those who had grown up in the fertile and temperate areas of Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina, that Nova Scotia was a pretty miserable place to spend the rest of their lives. So a good number of these men from the Duke of Cumberland's regiment who settled in Canada are actually going to come back to the United States. And I haven't been able to identify any record of the men from the 2nd South Carolina as having come back. So I don't know if Stanton or Clemens ever made their way back to South Carolina. I know there was a couple of men from the 1st South Carolina who actually came back, filed pension applications, and interestingly enough, received bounty land from the British in Nova Scotia, and then received a pension from the federal government. So they kind of double dipped, if you will, by serving both sides. As far as research on the book goes, that really was one of the most interesting aspects of it. Large number of men, I think I found at least 30, who had served with the Duke of Cumberland's regiment, accepted bounty land in Nova Scotia, and then came back to America and were accepted for pensions by the federal government. And in at least one case, it was a gentleman from North Carolina Continental, who had done that very thing, came back to North Carolina, got his pension, and some of his neighbors found him out. And they wrote to the pension office, and they said, this guy, served as a loyalist with a loyalist provincial unit, and the pension office was actually sort of compassionate about it. They said, he seems to be having a feud over who he voted for in the last election with these neighbors, so we're going to disregard this information, and he kept the pension in the rest of his life. So, but I found that really a fascinating aspect of that research. There was another case of a gentleman, he was a Virginia soldier who joined the Duke of Cumberland's regiment. He had this awesome escape story. And when I came across it, was in his pension application. And I was like, oh man, I cannot wait to put this in the book. He claimed that he had escaped from Charleston, was recaptured up near Orangeburg, sent back to Charleston, put on a prison ship. He befriended one of the Hessian guards who was on the prison ship, who introduced him to a Scottish captain. Befriends the Scottish captain who says, okay, I'll stow you away on my ship, and next time I'm leaving the city. So he stows away on this vessel. They sail out of Charleston. The ship is captured by a Spanish vessel off of Cuba. He's allowed to let go. The Scottish captain is taken prisoner. So I'm like, oh man, what a cool story. Well, the gentleman's name was Barzilla Phillips. And I don't think there were too many Barzilla Phillipses in the Continental Army. At least I haven't found another one. And there is a Barzilla Phillips who shows up not only on the Duke of Cumberland's regiment muster roll, but also on the list of land grantees in Nova Scotia. So the whole story was a fabrication. But he really broke my heart when I found that out. I'm like, oh, this is the guy who accepted land up here. So, in any case. Now, what does this brief examination of prisoners who fought with Marion tell us about the Revolutionary War in South Carolina? Well, in the instances of men escaping or breaking paroles to rejoin the fight with Marion, it really says something about the degree of resistance in South Carolina. The men just didn't go home after they escaped, those men who joined Marion. They wanted to go and fight against the British again. It really demonstrates their patriotism. The men who broke their paroles to fight with Marion probably were risking even more, because they did face the prospect that if the British did capture them in action against them, that they could be hung. And so it really demonstrates, as far as those men who broke their paroles to fight either with Marion or other commanders, partisan commanders in the backcountry, really the degree of their their interests in independence and fighting against the British. And there was a strong belief among these men that the British had broken that capitulation, that agreement that was signed at Charleston, and they felt very justified, at least men like John Postel, who had so much property taken from them, that they were perfectly justified in breaking that parole and going and fighting against the British. Now, had the British captured Postel, I'm not sure that they would have seen it that way. So anyway, it does demonstrate the degree of support for the American cause. But the numbers that joined Montague, either those that joined him voluntarily anyway, and those who were retaken at Nelson's Ferry by Marion, but insisted on going on into the hands of the British at Charlestown, also indicates that there was a limit to patriotic fervor. But again, I don't know that we should judge them too harshly based on what those men went through, at least those men who joined Lord Montague. Now, what would Marion have thought about those men? Well, we know he was very compassionate to prisoners. We know after the fall of Fort Mott, when Henry Lee was going to hang the loyalist Levi Smith, Marion personally intervened to save Smith from execution. We also know after the war, when he served in the legislature, that he had really urged compassion towards the former loyalists, and he very much opposing harsh measures against them. So based on this, we can only assume that Marion would have had the same kind of forgiveness towards his own men who had joined Lord Montague. Thank you all, and happy to have a few questions this afternoon.